Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Liz McSkeen, the founder and the director of Turas Press, and I am really delighted that you have been able to join us to celebrate the release of two wonderful new poetry collections from poets who you may already know a bit about, and if you don't, then I'm hoping that by the end of this hour, a little bit less perhaps, that you will know enough about them and be interested enough in them to want to delve into their work in more detail. And the two books that we're going to be launching tonight are that's Plain by Ross Hattaway, and Brink by Jo Burns. And I'm really honoured that these two eminent and in their own different ways rather provocative poets have entrusted their books to Turas Press. And you will see if you read their books, and I'm sure when you hear their poetry and hear them discussing their work, that there are certain points of contact, certain shared experiences, and also many differences, of course. But one of the interesting shared experiences that I think is worth looking out for is the immigrant experience, because both Jo and Ross were born in places other than their chosen place to live now. So they're both immigrants. And I think this comes out in their work. And I find that an interesting shared topic. Ross Hattaway is originally from New Zealand, and he's been living in Dublin for more than 30 years. He studied creative writing with Bill Manhire, and he has written 4 collections of poetry, including Plain. His first 2 were published by Seven Towers by our friend and publisher Sarah Vandenberg, who is now sadly deceased, and we like to remember her and remember her memory on occasions like this. Ross's 3rd collection was the first one to be published by Turas Press, and it was How to Sleep with Strangers, that we brought out in 2017. It was actually only the second collection that Turas Press published, which was set up earlier that year. So How to Sleep with Strangers being his 3rd collection, and therefore Plain being his 4th collection, his second with Turas Press. Jo Burns is originally from Northern Ireland. She lives in Germany, and she's a frequent visitor to Ireland and also a contributor on the international poetry scene. She's been shortlisted for many awards and has won several as well. And I'm going to have to read these because there's so many of them that I can't remember them. And so she was a winner of the Shirley MacLure Award, the Iowa Fortnight Prize, the Magma Judges Prize poetry competition, the Irish Writing in Germany Award, the Poetry Society Members Room competition, and last year she was the winner of the Listowel Writers' Week Single Poem Award. Turas Press actually published her first full collection, White Horses, back in 2019, and this is White Horses. Before that, Eyewear had published her pamphlet, Circling for Gods, and now I'm really thrilled that she has given us the opportunity to publish her second full collection, Brink. And you'll be hearing some poems from the 2 new collections in the next little while. So before I step aside and leave things to the poets, I'd just like to say a few words about the format, the running order for the next 50 minutes or so. And we decided to take advantage of the new Zoom culture to try out something a little bit new. And instead of having an introduction by somebody else about the different the 2 books, we thought that we would allow the writers to speak for themselves. So we're going to have a format where we will have poems read by Jo and by Ross from their books, alternating voices, and that will be interspersed with some discussion. I will ask them some questions for them to reflect on, and they may ask each other questions as well. And we thought that in the course of that process that you'd get to know a little bit about their work as well as hearing the actual poems, and we would just see how that worked as a launch format. So I think I've said enough. It's time to step aside and let the poets speak for themselves. Time for a poem or 2. Jo?
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here again. And also working with you as an editor is always a true pleasure. So thank you. I'm going to start tonight with a poem that was really key in structuring this book and inspired the title cover. And this poem is called Smuggling Apples. Now, the cover of the book is a painting by Gustav Klimt that was burnt in a castle in 1945 by the SS when they were destroying evidence. And this poem is one of a sequence of poems that are spread throughout the book of heroes and heroines of the Third Reich. So this poem is dedicated to Irina Sendlerova, codename Jolanta. Smuggling Apples. Picture this. Beside jurisprudence, Klimt's golden apples is engulfed. When the SS detonate a castle full of plunder as they flee, Schloss Immendorf and you and I, transported, cast a final look at the canvas bearing witness. Under branches, we'd hope to find Hesperia Arethusa, the dancing nymphs and maids guarding jewels while they sing among the green and gold in flames. But here I digress to talk about an apple tree, a secret backyard deep in Warsaw. Buried in the tomb of night, a pickling jar could be unearthed, screwed tight with names and code addresses. 2,000 children, decades younger. Now immortal apples, ripe unstolen. Let's speak of borders, foresight, prudence, how caging skies hold Eden under. I'll reveal a Polish nurse, a simple woman with a garden, smuggling carts of tools and babies and linen sacks for the older children. She trains her dog to bark to hide the cries from uniform. Teresa, Joran, Piotr, Katerina. Now we're back in Immendorf, watching Klimts from years before collapse and blacken in the flames as jurisprudence falls asunder. No 100-headed dragon, Ladron, just a huddled woman in the shadows with her tools, her drugs and sacks passing guards, at ghetto gates, and for a moment, just a beat, Jolanta's caught. But blind men shrug and let her pass, dog howling while she sings.
Okay, thank you so much, Joe. That was wonderful. I'm going to read the last poem in Plain. It's always good to start at the end. Then you can go if you don't like it. And it's pretty self-explanatory, I think. Sky. You come here and you don't know how the skies behave here, how these horizons lie, how the rivers work, when the wind will help, or some impossible mountain road. And you work on these things, and you work to understand these things. And after long years, you feel you know them. You feel they are within you. You know they are within you. You know you can use them as formwork for your life, and then they change, and they will change. Like your children, they will leave you behind on a road, behind on a river, behind the horizon, behind an impossible mountain, standing in the wind beneath a beautiful sky you thought you didn't know.
That's just beautiful, Ross. It makes me quite teary because my oldest son has just left home a few weeks ago. And that new life phase is very emotional.
Yeah, a new life phase for you and for him.
Yeah, And I love your use of repetition there. It just really brings the point home so strong.
What was it that drew you to poetry in the first place? Why poetry? Why not something else? Why not prose, or why not something completely different from writing?
I think before I could read for myself, I loved being read to. I loved the rhythm and patterns of children's stories. I think if Harry McCleary had been there when I was small, I doubt if I would have read anything else. And that's never really left for me. That the focus and the time needed to produce those things has always attracted me from as soon as I could read or write.
What about you, Joe?
Well, I always loved writing, and at school I was always quite a strange, quiet kid who read a lot and grew up with a lot of boys around me. So I spent a lot of time in my room reading. And poetry was in our family was quite a revered thing. So it was always there. I think for me, there's something magical about coming to an empty page with all these thoughts and images and crafting it into something that makes sense to you, at least. And it's quite a mysterious process. And I find it's very meditative. It calms me. Years and years ago, when my children were small, I used to run a lot of half marathons, and it helped me calm thoughts inside me. Now I find poetry does that. Yeah, and I came to it after, in my late 30s again, after a long break, like a lot of women, when they're raising children, they don't maybe have time. I came back to it in my late 30s because I felt like I was somehow, after 20 years in Germany, I was losing grasp of my native language. And poetry is really the ultimate distillation of language. So I found myself returning to it, reading it, writing it more in an attempt to really keep my own native tongue rather than 99% of the day speaking German. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like the precision of your poetry, it's obviously you're grappling with words and making them, using your craft with them to say exactly what you want them to say. So it's like keeping your skill honed, your language skill honed.
Well, exactly. And it is, I envy people who manage to just whip out a poem like that. For me, there's always a lot of effort involved. It happens very rarely to me that something just arrives on the page. It's usually a culmination of many, many drafts and looking for the right word and trying to find it. There is work and grasping for the right word involved in my case. And I do think that has something to do with spending most of my day speaking German, that I'm always reverting to something when I'm writing poetry.
Would that be the same for you, Ross? I mean, would you speak English all the time, or, a version of English?
I speak a very well-known New Zealand English, but I think you're right. I think it's a way to hang on to patterns of speech and the way you've spoken and thought for a lot of your life, and writing poetry allows you to put those rhythms down and maintain them. And while I'm not Polynesian, I'm Pacific Islander, but Polynesian culture is an oral culture, and because it wasn't a written culture, they used rhythm and incantation and repetition, all of those things, to recite history, to recite genealogy, to talk about events. And poetry has that. It's a very powerful way to remember, whether to bring your own memories back or to remember who you are, where you came from.
Okay. So before anybody gives out to me for teasing you about your Kiwi accent, I'm a Glaswegian, so nobody gets slagged for the accent more than I do. I mean, just one final question on that, Joe. You're Joe Burns. Any relation?
Oh, well, who knows? Who knows? I mean, certainly my dad and my uncles, who you have both met, would on occasion, after a glass or two, claim that the old ones claimed we were descended from them. But who knows? I don't know.
I'm sure there's a gene. There's a Rabbie Burns gene in there somewhere.
I don't know. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. I think if all that name did was make us all love poetry, then that's already something worthwhile.
So just in terms of you, I mean, the kind of themes that you both address in different ways, quite different ways, and we'll see that because we're going to hear several poems from both of you now, alternating in a minute. But you both have personal themes, but also kind of social political themes. Where do you get your inspiration from?
Okay, well, I'll go first this time, Ross. Then, I think for me, the social political themes come because I find personal topics quite hard to write about in the moment. I find personal topics, I need a time delay of about 5 to 10 years before I can actually write about them. So anything that you may read in a personal confessional poem that I've written is probably about 10 years old. Whereas I find it easier to write about social political topics now. And I don't know why that is. I think with personal poetry, I need to step out of the emotion before I write the poem. Whereas with social political, I actually need to step into the emotion. And it makes it easier for me to write it when I'm in the emotion, in the anger, which I can't do the same in a personal poem. So it's a very different process for me. How about you, Ross?
Well, inspiration incentive, I suppose, is partly from fear of my writing group. I think that, seriously, though, I mean, I'm not very prolific, and having to produce something every few weeks is a really good kind of push to knuckle down and do it. On process as part of the inspiration, I suppose, I've always carried a notebook and I write phrases down before I forget them, because children listening, you will forget them. You always do. I usually take a phrase or a line and I work maybe from there for something I want to say, or something I need to understand in the world and in my life. And probably, I think, certainly the social and political writing is starting from a position of, how does this happen? How do we get to this place, and trying to work that out. And sometimes you end up with answers. When I was younger, I wanted to find and I wanted to give answers and certainty to things like that. I think more often now I find questions as often as answers. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
I think it does. I think it's an answer, and it's not as if there's a right or wrong answer. It's a kind of a modus operandi, really, isn't it? I always think it's interesting to hear how other people get their ideas and how they work them through, because you don't really know what goes on in somebody else's head, or how what's in here actually gets out onto the page. So we kind of assume that maybe our own way of doing it is the way, but it's interesting to hear different perspectives.
Well, I think even just saying that probably the phrases or lines that occur to me, then you write down, they probably came out of the back of my head. So they're probably something that I'm already trying to process, whether it's an event around me or an event in my own life or somebody else's life.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, Ross. I was just going to say, I think that's really quite interesting. I find you're talking about maybe a line, something you've been trying to process. And I think what I struggle with sometimes when I'm writing is, particularly personal poems, I struggle with the idea of, I don't want to come across as navel gazing too much. And it's this permanent struggle, I think, that we're all trying to make the personal universal somehow. And so I do question a lot of my poems before I put them out. Maybe more than I should do. I don't know. And I struggle more with getting personal poetry out than maybe the political. Just wanted to add.
Sometimes I think it's a bit like, if I may chip in, that leaving a space for the reader. That I think the other kind of poems that you're talking about, Joe, I think are always worth writing. But I do that as well. You just wonder, is this something that is actually going to be of any use to read? And is there a space for the reader to come in here?
Yeah.
So
and if it's something very personal, is how can you make that relevant to someone who's never going to meet you, doesn't know anything about you? You may think, fantastic, I've really dealt with that, but it has to be more than that to be a poem.
Yeah.
So what about, speaking of poems, what about a few more poems?
I started writing poetry really to combat the fact that I was starting to forget words in English. So this poem really reflects that time that I was starting to write poetry again. Attrition. A man said time is the longest distance between two places. I say tongues. An accent can save a man or damn him. A woman can feel her native one slip away. I dream these days inflected, German sweeping up conviction, turning back, stretched over seas, booms and bows swung through the ventas, breezing roots to common dogmen, metered accents drowning stresses. My dialect sailing wars of discourse, back to where names are a confession, where English vowels split a nation. My tongue has always craved Verbindung, a union, homeward bound.
Going to continue the kind of drab loss and isolation, sadness and misery thing. This is Pacific. I grew up on the west coast of the North Island, and it's volcanic, black sand, which is you'll hear, and it's what we were talking about, and what Joe was just talking about there. How you worry about losing your sense of self if you're losing your sense of sound and language and rhythm. Pacific. I'm more of an exile than you'd think. Language increasingly steep, whispers of hill and tunnel, black sand bridging the gap between river mouths and harbour basins. Each word an inlet, each line a tide, each work an island, each joined to the others of this.
Thank you, Ross. I'm going to switch to something highly political. This was last year in the first lockdown, when suddenly the huge conspiracy theory movement started in Germany with anti-mask protests, etc. And a lot of these theories were spread over the social media platform Telegram over here. And unfortunately, a few people I knew got involved in this. So this was a deeply personal poem written in anger, but true. Fission. In the group's Telegram channel, the friend I lost shows herself, lifting her pseudonym after 6 months down the rabbit hole. I watch the dots blink as she types. Lieber bin ich Nazi als grün. I rage and rub illusions from my eyes to witness this hate in plain view. She'd rather be a Nazi than a Green Party voter.
As I get older, I find my language is kind of falling away. I think I can say things more directly, which was the advice I got about 24 from Michael Eager, and it still stays with me. This is called Hold. If we search for hurt long enough, we will find it, where everything's threatening everything we know or think that we know. If we carry grief far enough, it will take us to where grief is made, a high, flat, barren plateau, no ladder to get back down. If we hold hard things hard enough, defeat, regret, death, disappointment, if we should find a ladder, how will we know what it is?
Grief here. This is another one of my poems, really about heroes of the Third Reich. This is dedicated to Janusz Korczak, who was a children's author and a director of an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. As the silent ones thought and prayed, under stars the songs and stories burnt, to rain-soaked ash and rhythm, as crunching two light feet in snow were herded kindling on the platform. Past the power black flaming hearts, they marched to songs of women, children. In the wild lyrics of Treblinka, a people, embers, sky igniting. Among it rose a lullaby, so Kinder couldn't hear stones cry or fire. As Janusz walked, he sang. The words aren't known, nor do they matter. But they were kind, and at that moment, all of one man's life on offer. Blue knapsacks stacked below the chorals of rising beats, thin voices curling over bags packed full of hope. In Sunday clothes, they reached the line of a stanza where past and future go. A Kindermärchen with no ever after. Janusz is now at the threshold. His own soft words are the whitest lie, a blaze imploding on his shoulders. Gravity and melody implore and sing 200 in. Janusz, with them in the core, lights the way while light becomes him. Left and right, his arms outstretched.
I'm going to read something, I can't follow that. I'm going to read something quite different. Ostensibly a poem about childhood. I'm not so sure now, I've seen it in print. It's called Learning. They refer to names, places, and things, we were told. Names, places, and things. Only, we could have asked, only names, places, and things. But to chase this might have slowed our further learning, stopped us from moving on. We might have become lost in the mind shafts of the structures of language. We might have refused to come back.
As well, one of the things that I found interesting, Joe, was you quite liberally, and I remember this from White Horses as well. You quite liberally use words from other languages. In White Horses, you use Spanish and German quite a lot, and here I think it's mostly German. And you know, you don't use a glossary. Is this a decision that you make? You're not going to spoon feed the reader.
I think the thing is, to be quite honest with you, it is, when I'm over here, it is the way I speak English. Even when I am speaking in English here, quite usually there is a German word thrown in somewhere because I just get confused and I mix up words. And at that point, I can't always think of the English word. So I'll throw in the German word because I know my husband or my children understand both, whatever. Then when I'm editing, I do tend to try and take out the words that may need a glossary and put in the English one. I think I make the decision, words like Kinder, I think is something that the majority of English speaking people can deduct, even if they don't know that it means children. And so I try and make a decision based on how well known I think a word might be, that I can avoid a glossary if need be.
Do you have a position on the glossary, Ross? I remember in How to Sleep with Strangers, there were a few words that would probably not be known to, people who are not from certain parts of the world. But you didn't use a glossary either, did you?
No, I think that I probably used a few Maori nouns, but it's easy to discover what they are, and I think it's not a bad thing for people. I know as a child I read books where I wouldn't understand half of the lexicon, but it didn't really matter because then it's my reading and I can interpret it as I want. And I think poems are something, if somebody enjoys them, they go back to them and they reveal more of themselves. So it's not that important. And I think somebody challenged me on this. And I did point out, well, Irish poetry is full of words from Irish or Hiberno English structures, and nobody feels the need here to explain that. Or if people ask, they say, well, you can find out. I don't. I think it's a good thing. I wouldn't necessarily put large slabs of Greek in, like was it Eliot? I think did. But you're right for your time, and even if it's entirely in one language, most readers are not going to see everything that there is there, particularly not on a first reading. I think it's quite fine for people to go and explore what you put on a page.
I like to see other words, from other languages. It makes it just kind of emphasizes our connectedness, I think,
Yeah, and I think the language is the most obvious thing you have to unpack. But I mean, even in a poem that is completely monolingual, most poems, there's maybe allusions or metaphors to unpack. So the process of reading poetry is always unpacking somehow, I think. Whether it's the single poem or the entire collection as a body, there's always an element of unpacking in there to do anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Before we go on to read a few more poems, would you any questions that you might have for each other?
Well, how would you characterize your journey, your approach to form and style?
I think I'm actually quite conservative when it comes to form. I don't know how other people see that. It's always quite difficult to describe yourself, but I am quite conservative. I admit there is always a part of me that is concerned about how the poem looks on a page. And as much as I admire other poets who have long run-on lines, or in the modern contemporary American scene, there's so much that I admire, but I know that I probably wouldn't write it myself because it would annoy me how it looked on the page. And that's a little conservative part of me that probably will never change. And I see form more as a helpful tool rather than a handcuff. I find it helps me to bring in these big questions of the world into some kind of constraint. And I think if I didn't have it, I would probably rant a lot, Ross. So I think form is a very useful thing for me. How about you?
Well, I think, as I was saying, I find my language falling away a lot as I get older. I certainly don't need so much mediation through language. But I like the challenge of restriction. And certainly now more than I did. I find that tanka suits me, the 5-line Japanese form. I don't think English is elusive or concentrated enough for haiku to be successful. All haiku writers are going to not buy my book now. To be successful consistently. But with tanka, there's just enough room in English to say what needs to be said, I think. And the syllabic constraints still leave a lot of room for cunning and for surprise. Plain probably has a lot of formal structure, much more than the other books. You'd probably have to look hard for it, but you don't have to look hard for it. It's a constraint for me, not for the reader.
Yeah.
Okay. What writers inspired Brink?
Oh, writers inspired. I can't really answer that. I can really just more answer what inspired the book, what inspired me to write the book.
Question. Yeah.
I think it was just. I originally didn't think I would have a book in the pipeline for another year or two, and then the whole COVID pandemic started, and obviously this rise of far right propaganda over here. I mean, the scene that we all watched with the American elections a few years ago with Donald Trump and QAnon and etc., that all suddenly became very, very relevant in Germany, which was a huge surprise. And so conspiracy theories were becoming mingled into day-to-day life. People who were maybe critical of big pharma beforehand were suddenly now talking about QAnon conspiracy theories. And more worrying than this then as well, this was all intermingled with a very alive and well neo-Nazi movement in Germany. So this has all been going on for about 18 months, and it's all happening in the middle of me writing about different heroes and heroines of the Third Reich, but not being able to find the contemporary way into that topic. And really then, this is how I found my way in, this proto-fascism on the streets, people marching with Nazis, looking for mass rather than class. So very hard way to put it, but so that really was my opening point then to get into the Third Reich, but opened up this more contemporary view of how fascism can start up again, how the language can shift, how people's thinking can shift in a very short space of time. And so that's really how Brink came about. It's a book about society on the brink, people on the brink of being split from each other through different opinions, people on the brink of maybe a life change. Some of them aren't all to do with Germany or conspiracy theories, people on the brink of war. But most of the poems are concerned with those last moments before something huge changes, is how I would describe most of the poems in this book. So,
Okay.
yeah.
No, it's so while it's big events, it's still a very personal book. But
Yeah.
there's also a big mix of historical themes, art, science, other things. How important are all of these to your writing and the way you write?
Well, science is relevant to me only because I studied it for about 6 years at university. So I studied medical sciences to master's level. So that really is my academic background. I find science creeping into poems when I'm looking for precision, and there's probably a reason for that. I mean, science is precise, much as poetry is, and sometimes if I'm looking for a very precise metaphor, then science will help me with that. Art and artists, I am less well informed, and when I am writing about these, I am generally writing about the stories around the artists, either stories about what happened to people in their lives. I've also written in the past in White Horses sequences of poems about Picasso's muses. Yeah. And that's also an ongoing project still in my life. So I tend to write stories about the artists' lives rather than the art itself. I don't feel qualified to write as any kind of art expert. Yeah, I tend to find my own way into these people through different angles.
Okay. What about a couple more poems, Jo?
Yeah, okay. So I am going to read a poem called, let's see, German Autumn. So this was a poem based on a book by Stig Dagerman, a Swedish author. So he visited Berlin in 1946 after the end of the war. And this poem is really based on that book. German Autumn. Because the cellars are yawning, the stench of years and peace is revealing itself as empty stomachs. Because potatoes are gold and arbitration is in full flow. Because the city's alive, yet barely breathing. Because a woman sends her boy to scavenge. Because a man who turned his head lists now who'll speak for his character, for bread, because the cellar is finally airing and the trains are spewing those who fled to the country back into ash and silence. Because the city is censored and bound to a promise, and because shame is palpable on this side of the brink. Because the American languors at the station, and because the woman takes flour in exchange for her only currency. Because the man listens in court, unable to speak the unspeakable. Because something has fallen from a purse, a suitcase, a pocket, the sky. Because someone has fallen, a father, a grandfather, a brother, pride. The boy at the station is watching and waiting for his chance, barefoot in smoking rubble. The next poem I'm going to read is actually the last poem in the book. And this poem is written, I was talking before about conspiracy theorists in Germany, and this poem was written in March of this year, where a friend and I decided we had had enough of lockdown, and the two of us took a bottle of wine down to the river each, so 2 bottles of wine, and we sat and watched one of their demonstrations while drinking wine together. March. The populace open mic is on, and the crowd is waving Reichsbürger flags. Someone is harping on about vaccines, gates, reptilian overlords, and of course, 5G and Rothschild. I meet up for the first time with a friend since lockdown. We've the same intention to spectate the farce our kids are facing. But we're happy despite the distance, sitting together in our mission. We pop too many corks and prost on the pier above the rabbit hole, tipsy, dangling over murky water. Summer's coming, but we're split. Conspiracy or truth, and who's to say which is which or who is who? I've lived division in my youth. Now I face the moon expanding, with a breath that's not my own, in a land that's not my home. We are witnesses, whatever comes. I don't want to end on too dark a note. There are moments of hope in this book, but I will leave those for the reader to find. And there are also a few poems with humor in them.
Certainly, I did take that from the book, Joe, that it was an exploration of some moments of crisis or near crisis, and that the sense that if there is anything that is going to save us, I think it's woven throughout, actually, not only in 1 or 2 poems, because you have the courageous people during the Third Reich who did actually help other people, and it's the resilience of the individual, resilience and compassion and strength of the individual that is going to see us through, if anything does see us through. So it's a really powerful book, and it really kind of shows what poetry can say about the world that we're living in now. So fantastic, Joe. I'm really thrilled with it. So you wanted to ask Ross a few things, did you?
Yes, I would love to ask Ross. Ross, you were mentioning how you're very attracted to the form of tanka, and what always strikes me about your work, as well as being so precise and so moving, is how I would say it's very pared back and succinct. Excuse me. Why do you find that works best for you? How have you reached that point?
Well, I think it's always been compressed, the language. I do write longer poems, which are a bit more discursive, but there's still maybe not a lot of window dressing in the poems. I like puns, from the first joke I think I can remember hearing at about 4 years old was a pun. That idea of many things in a few words. I think what's changed is over the years is a move from density in the syntax to simplicity, probably more apparent openness. But then most poets do that eventually, so it's not unusual. I'm not prolific. I need something to say first and then a way to say it. And increasingly for me, syllabic poems, tanka especially, are a good way of keeping myself in check, of not letting, the language shout down what I'm trying to find out, what needs to be said.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. I really like it when a poem is spare enough that it can read very differently to different readers, to different people.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the end game.
Who would you count as your influences, Ross? So which writers have influenced you most, starting
Well,
off and over the years?
yeah, have we got 5 hours? I'm such a magpie. I think we're probably most influenced by what we read when we're younger. So, for anyone, you can see my James K. Baxter poems, my Hart Crane poems, Ruth Dallas poems, Meg Campbell, Rachel McAlpine, the Australian Bruce Dorr, people like James Grady or Bill Manhire or Loris Edmond. Now it's probably they're more part of the fabric, but not, part of the whole poem. You can maybe the sharp eye might see a Paula Meehan line or a Jack Gilbert opening or a George Mackay Brown worldview, or, a kind of alta backflip, or some kind of reflective nature of someone like Craig Powell, or the extreme compression of Doug Wood. If you think I'm pared back, you need to read Doug Wood. Bits and pieces surface all the time, but they're not the poem anymore in the way they used to be. It's almost what you build the poem on. I think as for who's influenced me most, there's no question about it, really. It's got to be Dr. Seuss. That's where it all started.
Okay, so
that's probably not very academic, but it's
no, but I think that's really interesting. I was just wondering, when you were speaking there, I mean, obviously growing up in New Zealand, and you mentioned a lot of New Zealand, Australian writers there. Have you found over the years a shift towards more influences from the Irish poetry scene, or less so? Do you feel that what influenced you in the early years is what sticks?
I think it's pretty. I think as you get older, you become more selective. So I would find John Hewitt someone that I would go back to, not that often, but I'm intrigued by that very forthright and honest sort of dialogue that he's having with himself a lot of the time, that he's interrogating his own ideas and thoughts. And I think I mentioned Paula Meehan, and there would be loads of others in Irish writing, and we could be here for hours, but certainly it's what I'm most exposed to. I find so many American and Canadian poets really interesting, but I also find that there would be a lot of writers who write so much in a poem that you're thinking, I can't digest all of this.
Yeah.
This would be a book for me. There are just so many words. The older, I suppose, your reading spreads out a lot. You're exposed to more things, and you become more eclectic in your reading, and you become more. It becomes more surprising what you do and don't enjoy reading poetry.
Okay, thank you.
Couple more poems, Ross?
Yeah. I'll read a couple more. They're both reasonably short. The first one, just a warning to anyone that if you feel you recognize yourself in the first 3 lines, then you probably do. It's called Strong. All my life I have been surrounded by small women who know how best I should live. And at the center of them has been you. And how shall I live now? how shall I go on living? For our children, you would say, for you, this is the risk we took. That is probably an amalgam of people I know and things in my own life. The second and final poem is the opposite of Joe. It's the first in the book, and possibly where the book started. In many ways, it's a gathering for me, I think, this book of, you know, parts of your life which are concluding and others which are opening up. And I remember I was saying to Liz the other day, there's a New Zealand writer who was criticised over many years for writing from a very male perspective. I don't know if he had that much choice, really. But yeah, this is a man's poem in some ways, but it's more than that. It's called Plain. A man stands in a field and considers the lack of tracks that lead to this, and if he will leave a trail from now on. A man stands in a cave and looks up in dark and quiet wonder at a roof of stars that cannot be stars, and forgets the sequence of breathing. A man stands in his garden, alone but clearly not, and falls through the moment, finds at last a string to bring him home. A man stands in his time, unable, even slowly, to stay within it, turning to catch it, but without any options.
Thank you very much, Ross. That seems to me like a really good poem to end with. Really powerful, and it is just makes me think of the cover of this book, which is very, very arresting. And as well as thanking Joe and Ross for their wonderful books and their wonderful poems, and for coming tonight, and all of you, I would, before we go, before I let you go, I'd like to say a few words about the covers. And Joe already mentioned the cover of Brink, which was the Klimt, the fabulous Klimt painting. Copyright fully paid up, of course, but also I just want to mention that the cover. I mean, we do judge a book by the cover, and Angie Crow from Crafty Crow Design is our designer, and she has really done us proud with all of the wonderful covers she's done of the Turas Press books. But she's been working with fabulous images, and White Horses has an absolutely beautiful. It's a detail from a painting done by Joe's cousin. Is it Michael? Was it Michael Burns? Yeah.
Yes, my cousin. He did.
Fabulous cover. And then Ross's covers were done by his brother, Paul Hattaway, who is an artist in Australia. So I think that we it's a good opportunity to acknowledge the work of the artists who helped to make these, as well as beautiful books to read, also lovely objects. So that's something that I'm really thrilled with. Finally, again, last thing before we wrap up, where can you get these beautiful books? Well, you can get them right now if you want. You can go onto the Turas Press website and you can order them. Or if you are close to any of the independent bookstores, of which there's a huge, wonderful network in Ireland, you pop in there. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them do stock Turas Press books. And if they don't have them, they could order them for you. And if you're not near a bookstore, do our website, or if you're not in Ireland, do our website. But we do like to support the independent bookstores, so if you can get the book from a bookstore, that would be great. So thank you so much for logging on, and thanks so much to Joe and to Ross for making tonight happen, and also for writing these fabulous books, and for letting Turas Press publish them. So hopefully we may meet again in real life sometime, but until then, goodbye and safe home.